All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for making it out, at least on Zoom, to participate in this educational event presentation. My name is Turner Roth. I'm in the New York YCL and the Communist Party, and have been, I and K, and Stephen, and Jafari, three other members, have been preparing this. And it's kind of one of the first in an educational kind of based around texts from CPUSA history that we're hoping to kind of continue in something like a series, trying to bring out or kind of bring to the surface a lot of these texts that really aren't read very much, are kind of hard to come by. Some of them, out of print. Some of them just not in stock in places where you usually find books online, and it's kind of a real shame. So part of the idea here is to really engage with in a meaningful way these texts written decades ago now, but which I think, and I'm sure many here agree, should be read more and are part of our theoretical history, part of our history, as a party, so that, I guess, the goal here, the idea is to just kind of bring to light or bring to the surface these ideas and share them amongst those who are already part of the party or the YCL, but hopefully as well with as many people out there who might be thinking about joining or just interested in what is I think significant contributions in the history of political thought in this country, and form examples of the interrelating of theory and practice, of those who we are reading tonight, or we hearing presentations on, formative in the existence, of the Communist Party. So I guess just the structure. I'll just give a brief introduction, and then we'll have Stephen Payne read or give his presentation on Claudia Jones, on the collected works of Claudia Jones, and then we will go to Jafari, who will be giving his analysis of Gus Hall's text basics, and then we will proceed to Kay Cabrillo, who will be giving a presentation on Claudia Jones's, on Ben Davis Jr.'s text, Communist Councilman from Harlem. Okay. So yeah, we are reading these texts and presenting them today in their relation to each other as testaments and examples of the multi-decade struggle of the leaders in our party's history to think the specific problems that adhere to this country's development and to build its potential future along the lines of a Marxist-Leninist intervention that both theoretically and practically meet the specific contours of our historical becoming. Each individual in both theory and practice applied the tools given us by the great international movements that, beginning in the 19th century with Marx and Engels, transformed the terrain of analysis, and consequently the possible futures opened up for a working class that had only recently come into being as a distinct class in relation to the bourgeois reconfigurations of ownership and power set in motion by the revolutions of the 18th century and the subsequent transformations of production in the industrial age. The Communist Party USA, formed in the years after the Great Russian Revolution had taken place under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, absorbed these lessons and applied them to a context half a world away, one which shared many of the same problems encountered everywhere the forces of capital had taken hold, but which presented distinct problems and demanded distinct solutions. The shadow of chattel slavery had only recently receded at the time these texts were written, yet in its place persisted the virulent forms of racism and oppression that were intimately linked to them, with Jim Crow segregation and the quasi-legal lynchings and terror continuing well beyond slavery's official end, affecting all areas of life in both the South and the North, where the descendants of the enslaved lived. It was in this context that the theoretical and practical advances of Marxism and Leninism were developed by our party comrades as the historically specific application of revolutionary dialectical materialism, which demanded not just the economic redistribution of power of, by, and for the proletarian class, but the re-democratization of the political and cultural institutions of this country, which had, since its inception, excluded significant segments of the population on the basis of racial as well as sexual difference, among others. The theoretical and practical contributions of comrades Claudia Jones, Gus Hall, and Ben Davis Jr. can only be understood in this context and form some of the greatest contributions to the undoing of the conditions that produce and reproduce these forms of oppression. The intersectional understanding of these issues, which in recent years have come into mass consciousness through critical race theory and the popular mobilizations that underlie it, can be traced back to the work of early members of the Communist Party USA, Claudia Jones in particular, who fought tirelessly for both the full inclusion of racial and sexual difference in the party and the country at large, but also for the revolutionary recasting of what inclusion looks like, where by no means is it merely a question of assimilation into the corrupt mechanisms of the American imperialist nation state, but of the creation of a new kind of state, a socialist state, whose unity would rely not on the same coercive mechanisms of power that had already existed. We thus find in these writings an awareness of the limitations of liberal bourgeois inclusivity that eschews the difficult questions of power and the need for a reevaluation and overturning of state mechanisms wedded to the economics of capitalism and the militarism that enforce it. On these grounds, therefore, would Jones, Davis, Hall, and other prominent communists be rounded up and put on trial for their subversive beliefs that capitalism itself, the American nation state itself, holds the primary responsibility for the continued oppression of Black people and women, as well as the working class in its entirety, Black and white, female and male. On trumped up charges of conspiring to overthrow the state by force, based on their commitment to Marxist-Leninist teaching, were they subsequently imprisoned or sent into exile. The juridical mechanisms of the capitalist state in the hands of McCarthy and his gang served to destroy the righteous movement of opposition to what the state served and still serves to protect property, whiteness, and male supremacy. Their jailing was meant to both halt the gathering power of the Communist Party and progressive movement following the Second World War, and to set an example of what the state is prepared to do to anyone who steps too far out of place and calls into question the legitimacy of the foundations on which the capitalist state has erected itself. We read these texts today, therefore, to better approach what those who preceded us sought, a world without oppression, first and foremost, but also the specific ways in which the burning questions first pronounced by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and others were adapted to the American context, given shape through the specificity of our historical struggles. We hope that with the reading and discussion of these texts and in the future other theoretical contributions from CPUSA members, we will be able to better define our approach to our current moment and give these texts a greater audience, hidden from view as they unfortunately still are from much of the contemporary American left, many of whom do not realize that much of our current concepts and practices owe their existence to contributions from Communist Party USA cadre. The fact that many of these texts are either not in print or out of stock is an issue that will hopefully be rectified in the years to come. Okay, and so with that, please welcome Stephen, who will give a presentation on Claudia Jones's text. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thank you, Turner. Let me share my screen here. 1 second. Okay. Everyone see that all right? Yeah, I'm guessing so. So yeah, I'm very excited to present on Claudia Jones, and also want to make sure to do her justice. So I decided that I'll do, a basic kind of overview of this edition itself, and then a little bit on Claudia Jones's life. And then I've really just chosen one text to do a deep dive into, because there's so much in this collection here. You can't even begin to do really more than one text justice, probably. So anyway, I think there's probably a lot more room for discussion of what's contained in this particular volume. So looking forward to the other presentations, and then looking forward to discussion and hearing the rest of y'all speak. So, and like I said, I'm going to start just with a general introduction to the edition itself before I even talk about Claudia Jones, because I feel like Turner, you were already bringing up some of the kind of real material aspects of book production, and I feel like it makes sense to start with this particular discussion here. And this is really the only edited collection of Claudia Jones's writings in existence, at least the only one I know about. If anyone knows of another one, please let me know. And this only came out in 2011. So really many props to Carol Boyce Davies, who not only produced this collection, but also wrote a biography of Claudia Jones, Left of Karl Marx. And I believe, at least last time I checked, I think Left of Karl Marx is more easily available than the collection of text from Claudia Jones herself, for one reason or another. So yeah, this is an incredibly important piece of work. And again, I can't thank Carol Boyce Davies enough for the work that she did in putting this together. Of course, she searched far and wide for the texts that are included in this edition. Daily Worker, Political Affairs, the Theoretical Journal of the Communist Party USA for a very long time. Kind of some of Claudia Jones's unpublished writings from manuscripts, at least what manuscripts that she was able to gain access to. She has a discussion of there probably being more manuscripts that she has not yet been able to gain access to. So there's hopefully a lot more of this to come as far as collections of Claudia Jones's writings go. And another thing to note, of course, is that this whole collection is framed both by Boyce Davies's introductory essay, and there's an afterword as well by Auric X. Cambridge, who was Claudia Jones's kind of personal assistant for, I think, maybe the last 6 or 7 months of her life. So he knew Claudia Jones relatively well. And yeah, so there's an afterword by him. And I'll circle back around to the general framing in a second, but just to give you all a sense of what is collected in this volume, there's three sections of Claudia Jones's own writings in between the introduction and the foreword. There's autobiographical reflections, and yeah, there's some really great pieces in that from Claudia Jones herself, reflecting on her life, reflecting, quite a bit on what led her to communism and the party specifically to begin with, and talking about certain events in her life that kind of precipitated that. And I'll get more into that when I do a short introduction or a short kind of overview of her life. There's essays. That's kind of the heart of the collected volume. And Boyce Davies divided it into categories. But as you might be able to see from the names of the categories, it's a little hard to impose a division like this on someone like Claudia Jones, where, everything is connected to everything else. So, there's a category that's basically essays on race and Black human rights, but of course it bleeds into all of the other categories. Same with women's rights. In fact, some of Claudia Jones's most famous, at least among people who know about her, writings on thinking through kind of a theory of that intertwines socialism and Black liberation and women's liberation all into one, comes in the women's rights section. And that's the essay that I will talk about in a little bit. There's a category, Black political prisoners in the defense of Black activism, kind of mouthful of a category there. And that's just one essay on Ben Davis, actually. So it's a pretty long essay and a very worthwhile essay to read. And then finally, the last category of essays is the Caribbean and Caribbean diaspora, which also has some very interesting interventions by Claudia Jones, and especially during the last part of her life, for various reasons. She was really thinking through her identity as not just a kind of Black woman, but a West Indian Black woman. And yeah, there's some really great essays in the final section of essays as well. And then finally, her poetry, which is something that I had not particularly come across too often before this volume and discussions of Claudia Jones, mostly because most of the poetry included in there was never published. But she wrote pretty extensive poetry, at least on her own, to think through things, to process things, etc. So it's a really great collection of Jones's writings, and I'm hoping that there's going to be more collections that come out, either by Boyce Davies or by other people doing work. And then to Turner's point again, this is something that seems almost perpetually on back order. I finally got my copy after, ordering from, I think I ordered from bookshop.org. It might have been someplace else, but I think it was bookshop.org. I don't know how long I waited between when I placed the order and actually received the book, but it was on back order a long time. It's on back order again, so relatively hard to come by, it seems. So that's just a little bit about the edition itself. Let me talk a little bit about Claudia Jones's life. Obviously, I can't be encyclopedic in any meaningful sense, and I just have a few dates listed here. Some of the pivotal events in her life, but there's many more events that are pivotal in her life that that I just won't really be able to talk about tonight. So she was born in 1915 in Trinidad, and lived there for the first 9 or so years of her life, when she moved to New York City with her family. And I believe, from what I remember, they lived in various apartments, Harlem, Washington Heights area, kind of here, there, everywhere, depending on the situation in any given year. And one of the things that Claudia Jones talks about in some of her autobiographical pieces is just the kind of daily experience of poverty and displacement that was woven into her early life. And so much so that actually in 1933, her mother died of what really, a very young death. And in Claudia Jones's own reflections, it's something that at the time when she's writing her autobiographical pieces that are included in this book, is still having a really profound impact on her. And she's still asking questions. Why did my mom have to die at a young age? And yet there's so many other women, particularly wealthier white women, who live until a ripe old age, but my mother died, and almost surely because of the poverty that they were experiencing. So that definitely shaped Claudia Jones's thinking. I mean, she still really was in high school at the time, and Claudia herself had tuberculosis for a year. And if there ever were a kind of sickness or illness that is heavily correlated with poverty, tuberculosis is certainly one of them. So she was bedridden for almost an entire year. So she didn't actually finish high school until 1935 because of that, and because of all of the various displacements she experienced. But while she was in school, she won multiple awards for public speaking, for debating, and was really a superb student. And right around the time she was graduating high school, her, I think, last couple years of high school, when she wasn't sick, she became involved in the youth branch of the NAACP, and also she was involved in the Urban League. Particularly, she was involved in theater through the Urban League, and she traveled around Brooklyn and various parts of Manhattan through that, and really started to kind of become a lot more comfortable with different parts of New York, with meeting other people, with entering into different neighborhoods. And of course, she had already become pretty comfortable with public speaking through debate. So this was the moment when she started to really enter into many of the characteristics that she would bring with her through the rest of her adult life as far as organizing goes. She entered into the party in the YCL in 1935 through 1936, and largely through the Scottsboro Boys case, which, for those of you all who aren't familiar with that history, or aren't as familiar with that history, it was a case in Alabama where a group of young men, actually a couple of them, were like 12 or 13. Most were a little older, but still teenagers, were accused of sexual violence against two white women. And the Communist Party USA was one of the main forces that rose in their defense, largely through the International Labor Defense, which was a kind of mass legal organization that many communists and others were a part of as well, but especially communist. And that actually in Harlem and in many Black communities was one of the first introductions to the party, as all of the actions that arose around the Scottsboro Boys. And sure enough, with Claudia Jones, that was her introduction to the party, and that was her entryway into the party, is participating in various actions in defense of the Scottsboro Boys, rallies. There were some really huge rallies in Harlem around the case, and at a time when in many other parts of New York, white people would literally respond with violence to Black folks coming into their neighborhood. When you see in the streets of Harlem Black and white people holding signs that say "Death to Lynchers," that I'm sure made an impression. And after Claudia Jones entered the party in YCL, she very quickly started assuming leadership positions in the YCL, and also was a kind of office manager at the Daily Worker, the CPUSA newspaper at the time, and very active in the party basically from the get-go. And I'm sure that she probably was under some type of surveillance pretty much also from the get-go. But 1942 is really when the aggressive surveillance of her started. And there were already various forces at play in the US, even in the midst of World War II, that were really pushing towards a kind of fiercely anti-communist stance. It took multiple years for that stance to actually coalesce and win the day, at least for a period of time. Really by like 1946, 47 is when that started happening more, especially after the election of Truman. But 1942, she was already under surveillance. And starting in 1948 to 1955, she and many other leading members of the Communist Party experienced kind of continual legal harassment, pretty much daily FBI surveillance. Claudia Jones herself served multiple terms in prison, all under the Smith Act or related kinds of pieces of legislation that were meant to criminalize the mere act of even being a communist. And it certainly didn't help Claudia Jones as far as the U.S. legal system goes, that she wasn't a native-born U.S. citizen. She got harassed continuously because of her immigration status. And in fact, that's kind of the excuse that the U.S. government used in 1955 to finally deport her to the U.K. So in 1955, Claudia Jones left the USA for good. I'm sure it was painful for her to leave many of her friends and comrades behind, but it was probably a bit of a relief to leave such a violently racist and an increasingly fascist country as the U.S. was at the time. Although she left kind of right at the moment when the major thrust of the civil rights revolution was beginning to start up in the South. So yeah, I'm sure that part, as the years went on, was a little bittersweet for Claudia Jones that she wasn't able to be in the U.S. for that. But still, when she went to the UK, she settled in around the Notting Hill neighborhood of London, and she stayed there until her death in 1964. She remained extremely politically active and was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but also helped organize the first Caribbean cultural carnival, and it's still going on today. And Claudia Jones was one of the main organizers of that. So she continued doing a lot of political work, a lot of cultural work, and really doing a lot of spectacular organizing still, even after all of this displacement and harassment that she experienced, and pain and suffering that she experienced in the U.S. So with that being said, let me see here. Turner, how am I doing on time?
All right, maybe 15 minutes or maybe a little less.
Okay, cool.
That's not a lot.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, definitely glad that I am only focusing on one essay, because like I said, there's so much in this essay alone. So signal to me if I'm running out of time here, and I'll try and speed things up. But the essay that I wanted to highlight is the essay that's probably received some of the most attention that Claudia Jones is responsible for. But all of the essays and really all of the writings by Claudia Jones included in this volume are well worth the read. So this is just a starting place more than anything. And this is an essay, an end to the neglect of the problems of Negro women that Claudia Jones wrote in 1949 for Political Affairs. And really the basic problem that she raises at the beginning of the essay is the experience of Black women is in 1949, and this is after now decades of the CPUSA really focusing on Black liberation, at least almost 2 decades of the CPUSA making Black liberation a central part of its program. But even after all of this, Claudia Jones points out that the experience of Black women is still largely being neglected, definitely in progressive movements, kind of broadly understood, but even in the party itself. And this is something that Claudia Jones certainly wasn't unique in raising. There was a whole conversation that had been going on since the 30s when there a large influx of there were especially a small kind of dedicated revolutionary cadre of Black men that had joined the party in the 20s, but especially in the 30s is when more and more Black women and men started joining the party. So this is a question that wasn't first raised in 1949, and it certainly wasn't first raised by Claudia Jones. Shout out to Louise Thompson Patterson, who was one of Claudia Jones's close friends and comrades and collaborators, and she had certainly been raising this question. A lot of people who were either in the party or friends of the party, like Marvel Cook, really spectacular Black journalist, had been raising some similar questions. So this is one intervention in kind of already a tradition of interventions along these same lines. And this problem, Claudia Jones points out, there's the obvious consequence of it leaving racism and sexism and the complicated ways in which those often intertwine and play off each other, leaves that whole thing in the movement unaddressed. But another consequence, and one that people certainly wouldn't always bring up at the time, and definitely is a consequence that among certain sectors of the left, people don't bring up now either, is that this neglect greatly weakens the democratic and class struggles. And the reason for that is Claudia Jones kind of launches immediately into the starting point for her whole investigation. She raises the problem and kind of teases out a couple of the consequences, but her real starting point is a thoroughly Marxist-Leninist starting point, which is always start with material conditions, always start with the concrete, always start with history and experience. And what Claudia Jones really considers along these lines is the material conditions of Black women in the US. So in this earlier slide here, the reason that this neglect of the experience of Black women in progressive movements in general, and the Communist Party USA in particular, hurts democratic and class struggles tremendously, is because of the history of Black women's objective position, both in the US and in kind of a wider world scope. So one thing that Claudia Jones mentions, she's drawing off of some of the more progressive strands of anthropology that were already coming into being at the time, and looking at the relatively more kind of power and authority that Black women in many African societies had for a long time before Europeans came and started enslaving people, et cetera, and even after and during all of that, women in many African societies retained actually quite a bit more power and authority over daily life than women in many European societies. That's one thing, but also the particular kind of brutality that the U.S. experience imposed on Black folks in general, and especially Black women, that kind of history of severe oppression really forced Black women in the U.S. to develop tremendous skills of organizing just for daily survival, organizing their families to try to survive all of the daily brutalities of slavery and displacement, organizing their communities to try to survive all of the daily brutalities and displacements of Jim Crow, and everything along those lines. So to neglect Black women for movements that are aiming for a new society out of this whole morass that's the United States, actually is neglecting one of the most potent sources of organizers. And Claudia Jones, as a Black woman herself, and as friends with many outstanding organizers, is very much aware of this. Another thing that Claudia Jones brings up, and this is kind of the part of the essay that is that has received more attention than any other part of the essay, are the kind of overlapping layers of oppression that Black women face in the U.S. as, first of all, as Black, then as women, and also as workers. And although Claudia Jones doesn't actually use the term triple oppression in this particular essay, it's certainly a concept that she gives a lot of shape to in this essay. Although even that too, from what I've heard from various people, including Mary Louise Patterson, the daughter of Louise Patterson, that's something that actually seems to have emerged maybe with one of the mass democratic organizations that the party was very involved in, the National Negro Congress. In the 30s, her mother, Louise Thompson Patterson, remembers discussion, Claudia Jones might have been a part of it, where this kind of concept of triple oppression first came about. This was like in 1936, I think. So anyway, it's already has a kind of life before Claudia Jones gives it this kind of written form, at least from my understanding. And another thing that Claudia Jones focuses on, and this is kind of the most straightforward approach to kind of materiality that you can, that at least that many people might think of it, just the pure kind of bread and butter issues of wages and jobs. So first of all, Black women in the U.S. have the lowest pay of all workers on multiple counts. Not only have lower pay than men in general, but have lower pay than Black men, and also have lower pay than white women. So the lowest of the low as far as wages go, and also as far as jobs go. At the time, and even now to a large extent, as far as the working class goes, the most menial jobs often are still, Black women are often still relegated to the most menial of jobs. And the same could be said to indigenous women and other women of color and other queer, non-binary, trans people of color as well. But Claudia Jones is focusing only on the situation of Black women in this particular piece. And at the time, the kind of most common job that Black women had was as domestic workers. And one thing that Claudia Jones would have been well aware of, something that existed in kind of throughout New York, but the Bronx, there were a series of studies that people like Marvel Cook and Ella Baker, and even Louise Thompson Patterson conducted on what was called slave markets. Basically, domestic workers would line up at a corner. Almost all of them would be Black domestic workers and women. And wealthy white women would come. Sometimes they'd drive up in their limousine, and they would have the Black women line up and they'd say, I'll take you for the day. And they'd bring them to their apartment. And, there's luckily some oral histories done with Black women domestic workers in the Bronx, no less, where they remember the kind of their boss, this wealthy white woman, messing with the clock so they'd end up working 14-hour days instead of the 8 hours they agreed with. The lady of the house, as it were, would move the clock back kind of throughout the day to exploit further, paying less than the agreed upon wages, just really terrible conditions of work. And of course, agricultural labor was still very prominent, especially for Black women in the South. And so Claudia Jones focuses on all of this, draws out a lot of statistics, wage statistics, kind of employment statistics to show the particular status of Black women as far as this kind of layers of oppression goes. That really illustrates Claudia Jones's point about Black women being oppressed, not merely as Black, not merely as women, not merely as workers, but as all at the same time. And as far as modes of redress to this neglect of Black women by progressive movements and the Communist Party, there's a few that Claudia Jones entertains here. So first of all is, again, a more kind of bread and butter issue as far as the workplace goes of hiring and promotion. So Claudia Jones is insistent that organized labor should be the strongest advocate for the preferential hiring and promotion of Black women, especially in questions of seniority, because of course, many unions, especially if they didn't have a progressive leadership, would regularly pass over Black people in general, but especially Black women when it came to questions of seniority. So this is something that Claudia Jones pushes organized labor to address in a more militant and radical fashion. Another kind of this is, I think, one of the most interesting parts of the essay, at least to me, is she doesn't use the term industrial concentration. That's a term, for those of you who haven't encountered it before, that's often used to try to think about the most strategic industries in which to encourage militant labor organizing and to focus resources, whether it's resources as far as monetary resources for organizing or actual organizers, members of the party in those industries. And Claudia Jones proposes that perhaps one of the most crucial things to focus on this particular moment in time in 1949 was the Domestic Workers Union. Again, since Black women were disproportionately domestic workers, at least especially in northern cities, this would have been a kind of call to arms to organize Black women and focus a lot of resources on doing so. And perhaps maybe not instead of, but at least in parallel to some of the more popular ideas for industrial concentration, the auto industry, electrical workers, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, a third thing that Claudia Jones proposes is really fiercely fighting racism and sexism in the party itself and the progressive movement in general. And one of the things that she stresses is to really center Black women's experience and honor their leadership. She brings up instances of Black women who'd been extremely active in, say, organizing in their church or in a kind of democratic or kind of mass democratic organization that they were a part of, but upon entering the party are kind of put on a almost like probationary period to prove themselves. And Claudia Jones points out the absurdity of a situation like that when the leadership skills had already been very well developed by the Black women that were subject to that treatment. And then another thing was just to fiercely root out any kinds of either extremely explicit or perhaps less explicit manifestations of white supremacy, whether that's in speech or behavior or kind of just patronizing attitudes. And there's various concrete examples Claudia Jones gives with that, but I'll skip over those for now. But if we have time at the end and if people are curious what she brings up, I'm happy to go back to that. And then finally, a few lessons for today from this essay that I think we can draw. So first of all, is the dialectical or relational intertwined nature of Black liberation and class struggles in our US context. So one thing I think perhaps maybe one of the key parts of this essay is Claudia Jones's insistence that actually concentrating on organizing domestic workers through the Domestic Workers Union should have been a central, absolutely central part of the progressive movement in general strategy at the time, but also the party's strategy. And the importance of that task would almost surely be lost on a pure class analysis, because people would, the common excuse at the time was domestic workers can't be organized. The work is too divided. People are in all of these individual households and they don't have much contact with each other, et cetera, et cetera. And besides, it's not a strategic industry, like something like auto production or steel production or something like that might be. But in Claudia Jones's account, actually organizing Black women through the Domestic Workers Union would not only just simply organize an unorganized industry, but would also unlock tremendous potential, because it would win the mass of Black women over to the kind of party's involvement in mass democratic and class struggles, and winning Black women over to that, as Claudia Jones points out in the first part of her essay, would unlock tremendous potential as far as organizing goes. And with that would come a huge kind of cascade of consequences, both in Black communities in general and also kind of in the wider democratic struggle. And another thing to take away from this first point here is exactly what the neglect of Black women by the progressive movement at the time, what the consequences of that were. So, one of the most immediate consequences is that many very talented organizers either were alienated from some of the main thrust of the progressive movement. I'm thinking here of Queen Mother Audley Moore, for instance, who was a tremendous organizer, but thanks in large part from everything I've gathered from her oral histories and all, to white supremacy both in and outside of the party. She left the party, and the loss of people like that was really staggering as far as organizers go. And also another consequence is if what Claudia Jones proposed, if it had been kind of central part of strategy, it started to become a central part of the party's strategy, actually, right around the time that Claudia Jones was writing. And I'm sure in no small part, thanks to her writing, domestic workers, there was a lot more concentration on organizing them. And there was a huge campaign to fight white supremacy in the party as well that was launched right around this time. But if it started a little earlier, I imagine that more support among Black women and also the wider Black community could have been won. And things like the NAACP kind of turning a blind eye towards McCarthyism might not have happened, because the driving organizers, especially at the local level behind most NAACP clubs, was of course Black women, was and still is. So anyway, and what Claudia Jones does is she doesn't put the burden on Black women at all. She puts the burden on white people in the party, white people who are progressives, to do the work and actually win folks over through kind of active anti-racism. Another thing is just the necessity to struggle not only through the party, but also within the party. And that's something that I've already mentioned a couple of times. I won't say much more about, but if we have more time in the discussion, we can. And then finally, just a question I'd like to raise: what is our contemporary domestic workers union? Obviously, tremendous attention needs to be paid to organizing Amazon workers. But I imagine we might be able to think of parallel sectors of the workforce that have huge numbers of especially women of color working there, like maybe home health care, but that might seem like they face the same obstacles as organizing domestic workers faced in 49. And of course, domestic workers are still many times largely unorganized. So I'll leave it with that, and thank you all, and turn it back over to Turner.
Great, thank you, Stephen, so much for that presentation. There's a lot in that book, and certainly it's impossible here to go adequately into all that her thinking on these issues entails. But I think some great points of just kind of flyby overview that we can hopefully talk a little bit in the discussion about. But I will pass it over now to Jafari, who will be giving a few words on Gus Hall's Basics for Peace, Democracy, and Social Progress.
Hello?
Can hear you. Yep.
All right, cool. I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay. Oh, no. Whoops. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting on Basics for Peace, Democracy, and Social Progress by Gus Hall. Okay, so we're going to start with an introduction on who Gus Hall is. Gus Hall was the General Secretary of the CPUSA from December 14th, 1959 to May 2000. So that's 41 years pretty much, or almost 41 years. He was born in the Iron Range region of Minnesota, and he was a founding organizer of the AFL-CIO. So he was in the labor movement for a very long time. He joined the Communist Party in 1927. He became an organizer and then later a national leader of the Young Communist League, which is relevant to us since we're the YCL. During the McCarthy era, the second Red Scare, he was indicted on the Smith Act. And what the Smith Act was, it was an act that basically set criminal penalties for anybody who was advocating for the violent overthrow of the federal government. So he served 8 years in Leavenworth Federal Prison for that. That's a shockingly long amount of time to spend in prison. But after he left that, he led the party as the general secretary for 40 years. And he also ran for president 4 times. So what we're basically going to be discussing is his work Basics, which is a collection of his People's World articles. They dealt with the topics that are mostly in the title that happened around 1970s America: peace, democracy, social progress, and the communist movement. The last one's not in the title, but the first 3 are. So it's called Basics because these articles are really, really basic. I have to emphasize that. They expound really fundamental things about the way that our organization, the CP and the YCL, views various social phenomena. And we'll see that in a second. So we're going to start with the first one, which is peace. That's part 1 of the book. So what Gus Hall says about peace is he starts off basically with imperialism. He calls it a bird of prey with its wings clipped. That confused me at first, but then I realized he was just saying like it's a bird that tries to get prey, but its wings are clipped by the workers' movement, because the workers' movement, it's a stalwart to imperialism, but it's an aggressive world force, of course. And capitalism and imperialism pretty much come together to create the military-industrial complex. It's influenced every institution and every aspect of life in the United States. So what is the military-industrial complex? It's the relationship between the military and our capitalist political economy. it's basically the influence that the military has over public policy. So our bloated military budget, sanctions, going to war with certain countries, they all work for corporations like Lockheed Martin, just big weapons contractors, et cetera, them influencing public policy. That's the military industrial complex. And aggression against socialist countries, they continue on and on. It's like kind of like never ending war. And it's a threat to actual peace around the entire world. The Pentagon, they relentlessly attacked the Soviet Union. And you have to note that this is during late 1970s America. So he's talking about his current context. They threatened actual peace by attacking the Soviet Union, basically being hypocrites. They limited the Soviets' arms, but increased their own. And they have a ton of military bases near the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union has none. And this still happens today. We can see it. I think Afghanistan is surrounded by tons of military bases, and we see that America is the biggest imperialist aggressor in the world. We don't see the second biggest power, China, doing things like that, setting up military bases in places like Africa or the Middle East. So it's still relevant today. So then he starts to talk about war politics, which is what I talked about earlier with the military budget. There's massive increases to it, and it seems like this is a permanent feature of the political economy after World War II. So there's a need for peace. American people pretty much have to wrangle control of the government from the clutches of aggression in order for world peace to happen. The arms race, the military industrial complex, this all comes from the proletariat lacking political power. So only the communist movement can really rein in the imperialist arms race. And we also have to support national liberation movements throughout the world. That also threatens imperial world order, because as we know, these imperialist powers, these former colonial powers pretty much exploit these nations for cheap labor, and they use imperialism in order to, or imperialism is what's occurring, but they use aggression in order to keep that going. So for each part of the work, I'm going to say a central theme, and it's going to be a really basic theme, but once again, this is basic, so it's not like super complicated. So the central theme of this part is that imperialism threatens world peace and can only be defeated through socialism. Oh, wait, did it skip one? No, democracy. Okay, the second part is about democracy. So it starts off talking about who endangers representative government in America. And this is pretty much three main forces: monopoly capitalists, the police state, and the military industrial complex. There are other primary forces too that you could say endangers representative government, but these are three that Gus Hall basically focuses on for this part. So these forces pretty much want to dictate people. That's their end goal. The end goal of capitalism is just to keep power in the hands of the ruling class, and the police state protects private property for them. Military industrial complex makes sure that imperialism can happen throughout the world. So it's very dictatorial. It's anti-democratic. We also notice here, and he's noticed during his time that he lived, that anti-communism is the enemy of representative government. It's really the enemy of the democratic struggle. We always see that under anti-communism, anti-communist policies, democracy is always limited for people. And it's actually really ironic that he's talking about this, because as we just talked about earlier in the background, Gus Hall went to jail for 8 years under the Smith Act, and that Smith Act was against anybody who's advocating for the overthrow of the government. We should be allowed to advocate for the overthrow of the government. That's one of our rights, and it's a democratic right, and it was taken away. So we can see where Gus Hall is basically coming from for this. So the democratic struggle, it's a central struggle to the proletarian movement. It's been a central struggle to the proletarian movement since its inception, since Marx. And another thing that he talks about in this section is racism, which is monopoly's hammers against the workers. So Black workers are the most oppressed group of people in America, I guess, as a worker. And I remember Henry Winston also went over this too. He called Black workers triply oppressed. They work the dirtiest, dangerous occupations in relation to their white counterparts. And Gus Hall claims, and it's of course, the ideology of the party that the source of racism is capitalist exploitation. White workers can carry and support this racism, yet they're also victims of it as well. But the end goal of the workers' movement would be to fight against racism, to liberate all the workers. It's in the best interest of all workers to be liberated under socialism. Of course, for Black workers, obviously, because they are triply oppressed. I think, I don't want to misquote Henry Winston, but I think he said they were oppressed like under the threat of fascism, under monopoly capitalism, and then also just as workers in general. But I'll look up that quote and I'll try to correct myself or something like that. I'll tell Turner. Anyway, so Black workers, obviously, it's within their interest, but it's also within the interest of the white workers, because the white workers are exploited as laborers too. Their surplus labor is still being extracted. That's still oppression. So the next thing that Gus Hall talks about in this work, or in this section, is capitalism's fascist mentality. So fascism, I put fascism as an outgrowth of fascism in the slides, but what I meant to say was fascism is an outgrowth of capitalism. Fascism extends the ideologies, the values, and the morality of monopoly capitalism. And anti-communism always tends to show up whenever fascism shows up, like it's their main weapon. Hitler and McCarthy had that in common, despite, from a liberal mainstream perspective, McCarthy would stand for liberal democracy. I laugh just saying that, but from kind of a mainstream perspective, he stands on one end, and then Hitler stands on the fascist end. So they're both supposed to be standing on opposite ends. But we know as Marxists that since fascism outgrows from capitalism, they're one and the same. So the central theme of this section is that capitalism at its core is anti-democratic, while socialism is pro-democracy. And once again, that's very basic. Okay, the next section is social progress. So in this section, when I usually think about social progress, I usually think about it in relation to kind of like liberation struggles centered around identity. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. That's not the full definition of it. But in this section, what I want you to keep in mind is that he's talking about social welfare, like the welfare of the society. So one of the articles, Crisis in Medical Care, he starts talking about how we need a society that prioritizes human welfare. Capitalism obviously fails to do this. There's a sharpening contradiction between the maximization of profits and the welfare of human beings. And we can see this, of course, with our struggles for Medicare for all, or for some type of universal healthcare, or just some type of healthcare system. We know that the main people standing in the way of getting that system together is, big pharma, big pharmaceuticals. They want to keep our insurances at extreme rates, make sure people are uninsured, make as much money as possible, milk as much money from the people. So social progress would, of course, be to fight on the side of this contradiction of the workers and make sure that their welfare is put first instead of profits. Another thing is, there was another article called Poverty on Rich Mountain, and it talked about Appalachia, which is a region in Virginia. It's a visually beautiful region. It's very mountainous, but it was destroyed by capitalist exploitation. It's very impoverished. It was impoverished at the time, and it still is very impoverished. Just lack of education there, a lot of reaction. It's not a good region. It's a region that has a history of worker struggle, because there was a whole like Blair Mountain battle, I think, that happened around there. I might be getting that wrong, but there's a history in that region of workers, but it's basically under exploitation. And something interesting about this article is he calls out class collaboration unionism, which is a form of trade unionism where union leaders basically contribute to corporate power. They try to collaborate with corporate power in order to make whatever they're fighting for more profitable. So they're really fighting against the people. So it's very class collaborations. So the solution for that is a communist party that leads struggles in unionism, which is historically what we were supposed to do anyway. So the fact that the Communist Party needs to be there at the forefront would fight against this class collaboration communism. Another part of this section is the nature of the economic crisis and its solutions. This, like I said, is a very basic section. It talks about how capitalist nations, they're facing depression at the moment that he wrote this. And, that's an inherent feature of the boom and bust business cycle, which was laid out by Marx a long time ago. Workers are always the victims of this depression, and the ruling class simply get richer. We saw this just last year with the pandemic. It caused a recession. People were doing very bad. We had to have a stimulus check, but there's plenty of research that went into how profits for major corporations just went up like so much during this time. So yeah, that boom and bust cycle is always going to be within capitalism. So it's the nature of the economic crisis. So what we need to do basically is reappropriate the billions stolen from the workers and use those resources once again to support human welfare. Better hospitals, roads, schools, etc. Just communities that are really have resources behind them. And, a social system that sees to that is pretty much socialism. So he also talks about the purpose of world monopoly capitalism. And in this section, he says that critics argue that capitalism lost its purpose, but its purpose has always been the same. It's to serve the ruling class interest. So the movement for socialism, that's the only solution to the inherent contradictions of monopoly capitalism. Like I said on the last point, since socialism is a social system based on the welfare society, and it's not based on profits towards the rich, which is the current society that we're in. So the central theme of this section is that social progress can only come through the struggle for the welfare of society, which means we have to struggle for socialism. Okay, this is the last section, the communist movement. So what Gus Hall basically starts here is he says that socialism as an idea, it existed before the explicit socialist movement started back in the 1860s era with the workers' movement, Marx and all that. Communal life was already known to Native Americans, so it was already known technically in America, and that's much closer to socialism than the capitalist forms that were bought by colonialism. But Marx's organization also rose under capitalism because the capitalist relations to production give birth to socialist organizing, and this is basic dialectics. Phenomenon, like under dialectics, phenomenon always give birth to their opposites. So the way that this would work is that since capitalism is bringing everybody kind of, in Marx's time, of course, into a factory, but it's basically bringing everybody under production, they're able to organize better against that exploitation. They're able to raise their class consciousness and fight against it. So this basically is where the working class starts to take its place as the revolutionary class because of that socialist organization, even though there's capitalists owning the means of production. So the birth of the communist movement, that's another qualitative leap in the Marxist movement, as well as the Russian Revolution. He's talking about the communist movement in America, but he also says that the success of the Russian Revolution is like a huge qualitative leap. The revolution built the first socialist state ever, and it revealed the science of revolution, which is Marxism-Leninism, which is Marxism in the age of imperialism. So he goes out, and this is all in one article, but I think that really this article kind of summed up the entire section, so I drew from it the most. He talks about the revolutionary aspects of the Communist Party, and I think that's the most important part of all this. He kind of just lists out a few features that we should be supporting, we should be pushing for, but that we've also historically kind of pushed for. So here's some revolutionary aspects of our party. It has independent party activities, but it's also balanced with leading the united front in various movements. So like the labor movement, the environmental movement, the movement against racism, et cetera, et cetera. We do things as a party, but we are also united in leading out those struggles. We draw lessons from the US working class, but we also draw lessons from the world working class, from the examples set out by other socialist revolutions like China, Russia, Cuba, Vietnam, et cetera. We struggle against opportunism. We struggle against opportunism, whether it comes from the right wing or the left wing. We're the vanguard party that pursues the mass line. We struggle against the empty rhetoric and dogmatism and I feel like I should have put this point right before this earlier point, because I feel that opportunism and dogmatism are both kind of related phenomena. But the fact that we fight against those two things, I think that's really important in our struggle. And we have a glorious and proud past and exciting future. The Communist Party is over 100 years old. There's plenty of people who have been associated with it, who are very courageous, brave workers, brave in the workers' struggle. And he actually goes on to gives like kudos to a few. He gives a kudos to a bunch of historic leaders, but I named a few right here. There's William Z. Foster, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Henry Winston, Benjamin Davis, Eugene Davis, Claudia Jones, which the earlier presentation was on, James Ford, Anita Whitney, W.E.B. Du Bois, Theodore Dreiser, John Reed, Al Lannon, and Geraldine Lightfoot. So the central theme of this section would be that the communist movement is led by the Communist Party. That's the vanguard movement towards workers' power and eventually a communist society. Okay, so what's the conclusion of this? Like I've been saying throughout the presentation, these articles are basics. They are foundational concepts that we're all pretty much aware of in one way or another. None of the concepts that he really went over in these articles, and these were People's World articles, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier. These were People's World articles. None of the concepts here were like concepts that are too complicated or too deep in Marxism. They're pretty much just foundational. They're things that we should all kind of be aware of. So it's important to review those basics. We have to remember that communism is a movement by and for the masses in our current stage. And the masses, they need their class consciousness raised. And to them, these concepts are also basic too. The masses aren't completely ignorant of the military-industrial complex, or they're not completely ignorant of anti-communism back then, anti-communism being used for anti-democracy, or even that today. They understand these things. They live in society, so they have to in some form understand them. But it hasn't been formulated in a proper Marxist way. And that's pretty much our job to raise class consciousness, to take the issues and struggles that the masses have and kind of present it back to them under a Marxist framework. Gus Hall led the Communist Party for 4 decades. That's a massive amount of time. Our struggles, they're built on the work that the previous generation did. It's their history, their actions, their writings. Those all serve as the blueprint for our movement forward. Here, as the Young Communist League, we're the future leaders of the Communist Party USA. And we've inherited the most important social task of our time, which is the complete liberation of all of humanity. Which is that's a super tall order. It's a really big deal. It's the biggest deal in society until it happens, in my opinion. So we have the responsibility of mastering the basics. Through educationals like this and consistent practice, will lead the movement to its final victory, the communist movement. And that's pretty much it. That's my presentation. I'm not sure how long that was, Turner. I'm sorry if that was too short.
No worries at all, Jafari. That was perfect. Thanks so much for breaking it down. That text, by the way, is extremely hard to find. I think it didn't exist anywhere that I could find, but we had a copy at the office. But again, just to underline, there needs to be more copies of these texts out there, even though they have age on them now. I think they are still very much relevant and are important, particularly for us, as Jafari laid out, as we rebuild YCL and the party to have these ideas in mind and to have these reference points, because it is our history as members of the Communist Party. So we will move now to Kay, who will be giving a presentation on Ben Davis Jr.'s Communist Councilman from Harlem. Another text, difficult to find. Kay had a copy, so they will present on it. Go ahead, Kay.
Thank you for that. Just my camera. So yeah, everybody's nice presentations and slides and stuff. I don't have any slides, so you just get to look at my face. But I'll be presenting on Communist Councilman from Harlem, autobiographical notes for, written in a federal penitentiary. Now, why were they written from a federal penitentiary? That's a very good question, and we'll get to that. But Ben Davis, specifically Ben Davis Jr., was a party leader, obviously became a councilman in Harlem, ran on the Communist Party ticket. So a little bit of background, just running through major life events. He was born in 1903 in Dawson, Georgia, moved to Atlanta when he was young with his family, went to Morehouse College Academy for high school, graduated in 1920. In 1925, he graduated from Amherst College in Massachusetts for his bachelor's. And then he went to Harvard Law School and graduated in 1929. 1932, he briefly worked as a journalist before starting a law practice back down in Georgia, specifically Atlanta. 1933, he worked on the infamous Herndon trial. 1935, he moved to Harlem, New York, and worked as an editor of the Communist Party's Negro Liberator. It was a magazine that was targeted specifically toward Black workers. 1943, he was elected to the City Council, New York City City Council, with the help of the party and a good friend, Paul Robeson. 1948, he was charged with violating the Alien Registration Act alongside 10 other Communist Party USA leaders. And that act basically made it illegal for anyone in the US to advocate, abet, or teach the desirability of overthrowing the government. It's very general. 1949, he was expelled from the City Council due to that, the aforementioned act and the Smith Act. His appeals were denied. So he spent about 3 years, 4 months, I believe it was, in jail. 1962, Davis was charged with violating the Internal Security Act, but he died of lung cancer 2 years later before the trial could proceed. So his life, the span of his life, took place during some highly dynamic times politically in the United States. There's hardly not a dynamic time in our history, but this was especially so. So from about the post-Reconstruction era, leading up to World War I, through World War II, through the Civil Rights era. And some other bookmarks in history you could think of are he lived through the first and second Red Scares. So his father was a major Black political leader. Du Bois wrote about his father, and I think it was a trilogy, specifically The Black Flame. He wrote very nicely about him. His father was a major figure in the Republican Party back when it was more Lincoln flavored than whatever it is now. And his father fought for enfranchisement for all voters, but especially Black voters coming from the South in Georgia, and fought for those types of things along with the other side of other types of reforms through fraternal societies and churches. And he also had a position on the Republican National Committee or Conference. And so this book was written in the Terre Haute Federal Penitentiary in Indiana, where Davis was from the time that he was charged with trying to overthrow the government, or at least advocating for it. So this leads us pretty nicely into the first chapter, Dawson, Georgia, where Davis was born, was a small-ish town, as like 10,000 people. There was a railway line that split the town in half. The Black folks lived on one end and the white folks lived on the other. And yeah, it was very, I mean, all the differences you might imagine, the stark differences between like living conditions, educational opportunities, transportation that was available, and like the quality of the infrastructure. People were living in shacks generally on the Black side of town versus, you know, multi-story buildings on the white side that were more prominent. And so the atmosphere that Davis describes here is it was a piece of domination. So you think about like the type of peace that you might hear come from the State Department or like a US president, is really this type of peace where everything's okay as long as you don't raise your voice and try to, you know, determine your own future, assert your humanity. So that's very much the case in this town. Ben's dad, fortunately, had worked himself into a relatively well-off position. So he was in the middle class, but even so, those differences were pretty stark. And Ben's family came from one that was where he grew up where slavery was in living memory. His grandmother was born into slave society, and you'd hear tales about his grandfather all the time, who had resisted, you know, the master and was sold off shortly after the incident. His grandmother had scars from that, physical scars, not just experiential. And so Ben describes this this situation as one where progress, as it was popularly conceived, was to be earned individually. You had to go appeal to some liberal folks, liberal capitalists and philanthropists. And often that freedom, that progress only meant anything in that you were able to do whatever you wanted to Black people, even if you were Black yourself. And so it's like that dynamic that's really unhealthy and splits the working class. So shortly after Ben is born, within a few years, the family moved to Atlanta, and Ben was educated there. There was a split in the Black community. The higher class, and this is where colorism starts to play a role. There's, you know, lots of lighter skinned people who are kind of elite, upper society types, went to Atlanta University, which was funded by the Rockefellers. And then there was Morehouse, which it was kind of unclear when I read it in the book, but I think it was I don't think that one was funded by the Rockefellers, but I may be incorrect. But when Ben goes to Morehouse, he's in high school. This is where his first public battle on the basis of collectivity happens, and he's fighting against a policy where the student body, which included lots of older people because they had a more working class student body, they had to stay in a study hall. And so they were there like all day, including into the night. And so Ben helped organize a student strike there. And it lasted for a few days until a really popular staff member, you know, talked to the students and was like, you know, you need to come back to class. And they did. And Ben and the other organizers were expelled, but Ben's dad talked to the administration, and the punishment was lowered to suspension. So that leads into Ben becoming a lawyer, and he starts to talk about he went to court because he got up and gave a seat to a pregnant woman on a trolley and then accidentally sat in the white section, and then he was kicked off. Whole scene. So his dad had to use his reputation to kind of save his son some trouble. They were in the courtroom. Ben saw some sexual harassment going on with police officers and the magistrate, and Davis Jr. was like, what's going on here? Like, that's, these are law enforcement officers and they're able to do this and no one's making a fuss about it. And Davis Sr. was like, well, that's why I want you to go practice law. And so that, plus some other factors, pushed Davis Jr. in that direction. And so he talks about the lack of Black lawyers in the South being a product of the courts being pillars of the Jim Crow system, and the practice of law and law enforcement is inherently white supremacist. So like if you're trying to defend yourself in court, having a Black lawyer is a weakness unless you're dealing with really inoffensive cases, inoffensive to white people cases, or cases that only deal with issues between Black people. And I see that I'm going to go longer than I thought. So I do want to leave some time for discussion because this is good stuff. So we hit the Herndon case, right? 1932, Davis has just started up his law practice, and within a few months, there's the Herndon case. For those of you who don't know, Angelo Herndon was a party member and organizer who was faced with death because he dared to hold a protest where Black and white workers were working together to earn themselves some money during the Great Depression, which is pretty wild. But a quote from the chapter says, "It was the real beginning of the interconnection between my personal desire for dignity and equal rights and the aspirations of the masses of my people for first-class citizenship. The oppression of the Negro people, the economic crisis, and the Herndon case became one inseparable issue. A lot of things, hitherto unconnected, began to fall into place. A pattern was emerging." So he goes to court. He's there talking with the judge. And there are some things that he points out in the book, like the state made it a point that they harbored no ill will toward the KKK, but it probably wouldn't be good to have people from the KKK representing any sort of prosecution. So they were held to be a respectable organization on the whole. And then, throughout this whole case, and further on after the trial, he talks about how the question of whether they were going to use the N-word or what have you in like official court documents during official proceedings, that was an open question, and he tried to counteract it, and the judge would tell him to shut up. So like this is a toxic environment. But over the course of the proceedings, the unity of the workers organized by the Communist Party was strong enough that no one would rat for the Klan during the case. And Davis, in the course of trying to build a good defense, joined the party. After he went to a few meetings, he was talking with Herndon, and he's like, these people are serious and they're doing good work. And, I have to be part of this, right? And he makes it a point that he didn't become a communist because, the communists were just so swank and cool and persuasive and all that stuff. He said, the capitalists made me a communist. There was no other way to fight for the freedoms that Black people need. Like, there's just, you try to build resistance on your own, and the splits that happen between Black workers, Black people, and white people block your way. If you try to work through the Republican Party like his dad did, well, the Republicans and the Democrats agreed to move the National Guard out of the South and let Black people fall to the wayside, right? So you couldn't trust that. And of course, we're living through the part where the Democrats leave everyone to the side. So the communists really present the front here, and he repeats that throughout the book. And there are lots of things that if you read more communist theory, you recognize, and he puts it in the context of practice. So a quote from one of the prosecutors, I think his first name was John, but his last name was certainly Hudson. I have that recorded here. And this is powerful because it's coming from the prosecution. It says, no matter what you do with this Angelo Herndon, thousands more will arise to take his place, to fight the battles of the Negro people and the workers until they are free. So hopefully a bit of foreshadowing for those of us who are building that movement now in the party in the YCL. But unfortunately for Herndon, that trial did not go well. The jury ended up ruling Herndon guilty after the prosecution just went off on tangents about, the communists are an affront to humanity, they work for Satan and all this stuff. And so after the trial, there was a defense committee that came together to save Herndon. I don't know if I mentioned it, but the was it the International Labor Defense? The ILD was getting harassed by police because the Herndon's case was spreading around the world, and they wanted to, weaken the defense as much as possible. They tried to offer Davis positions in the Republican Party that were really high up to try to persuade him away from it. Nobody would budge. They pushed the trial all the way to the Supreme Court as far as appeals go. And the first time, the court wouldn't hear it. And the second time, they won 5-4. So Davis goes back and says, well, why did we win even though I wasn't an expert? Because remember, he was only practicing law. He only passed the bar exam a few months before he took up this trial. So he said the difference between this and he uses the example of the NAACP style struggles was that the legal struggle is not the be all end all, right? The struggle extends beyond that. And that's really the difference between reforms that tend toward revolution and reforms that are just ends unto themselves. So he says Herndon was not a victim of excesses of an otherwise sound capitalist system. The trial shouldn't have happened, whether it was a fair trial or not, and one should take exception to the capitalist system itself. And this trial can be viewed more accurately as an extension of the class struggle in the judicial arena. Not that we should disregard everything else. He says that the Southern capitalist class put Herndon on trial, so the working class and Black people couldn't save him by mass counter pressure. And so you need militant resistance on all fronts. Anything that represents, a democratic fight against these forces that oppress Black people and all workers. So we go into the next section of the book where he talks about city council. I'm not going to make it all the way through, but I will be scanning this book because it is very hard to find. So be on the lookout for that. I think all your emails should have been registered with this event. So yeah, he moved to Harlem in 1935, just to recap, and he was there, he was active, he was with the Communist Party, working as an editor for the Negro Liberator and for the Daily Worker, which would become the People's World in the future. And while he was working there, he's participating in doing community work in Harlem. And so what happens is that there is this policy of proportional representation in the city. And so each political group, is guaranteed some level of representation based on the population. So there is a Black person who is on the city council, and they are planning to go on to Congress. And the issue is that person is the only Black person representing Black people on the city council. So the party, Davis in particular, was worried that with the loss of Black representation on the city council, and not just token representation, but like actual, like we have someone who is willing to fight for us representation on the city council. And with no one else able to step up, Davis is substituted for a Carl Brodsky on the ticket. And so the party worked with Davis. Paul Robeson worked with Davis. Paul Robeson is also friendly with Davis. And so the party decided we're going to move forward with this campaign. And some people were skeptical. And so Davis talks a little bit about the idea of democratic centralism and how great it is, because once the party decided to move forward, they could say, here we are with this action. How can we take everybody's perspective and make it useful for what we're doing? So the people who are in support are, of course, useful on the campaign. And Davis even goes so far as to say he wanted more skeptics on his campaign, because the skeptics helped point out weaknesses and places to focus for the campaign, because they're dealing with less resources than the Tammany opposition. And I hope I'm pronouncing Tammany correct. For those of you who don't know, I had to look it up myself. Tammany was like a political organization that was known for its corruption, based in New York City. And so they had a stronghold in the Democratic Party at the time. So Davis says, uniting around a progressive response to issues is a winning strategy for getting a broad base to support a campaign. And if you watch any of our party outlets on the website, on the People's World, if you watch Good Morning Revolution, which is on our YouTube channel on YouTube, I, speaking as a party member, not as a YCL member, whatever. But you hear that response to the challenges of today, right? That we need to focus on issues over parties. So if there's an elected official who's pushing issues that need to be dealt with in a way that advances the struggle, and doesn't just take that issue as, once we get this fixed, everything will be okay. But once we get this fixed, that will be a foothold for us to struggle further on somewhere else. We can support that, the resolution of that issue in that way. And so some quotes from this chapter: the ruling class can unite only on a reactionary program, and the working class only on a progressive one. Another one: my electoral victory rested upon years of conscientious and consistent work of the Communist Party in Harlem in the struggles of the Negro people. And so you see that the electoral struggle and struggle on the streets, right, so to speak, are not divorced, right? You need one to do the other, right? Because ultimately, right now, we're after power, because we need state power to do what the working class needs us to do. And we can't get that if they don't know who we are, if we're not on the streets actually building our reputation as that type of organization. And our work on the streets will be stopped by those in office when they call, massive amounts of cops on us if we don't have some foothold in state power. So Davis ended up being elected and served as a partner on the city council with Pete Cacchione, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not great with Italian. And so he ends up the chapter saying that communists work to advance these qualitative leaps forward and prevent qualitative leaps backward. And we're still in the situation today where there are movements toward these backward leaps that would leave us in a fascist state. And we have to resist these and take those steps that move us in a direction towards socialism. And so, Turner, how much more time do I have? I don't know if I should wrap up.
Yeah, we just wrap up, good.
All right. So once Davis is on the city council, he starts to introduce all these pieces of legislation along with Cacchione. And many of these pieces are addressing things like segregation in housing, civil rights. For example, the Negro History Week became an official thing in New York City and then the state. And then that led to Black History Month. And that was through Davis's work with local organizations to advance that. So he struggles against Jim Crow. And some people even credit him with, heading up the beginning of the civil rights movement from here in the city. And other people take care of other places. So there's lots of that work that goes on. Later on, he is charged with violating the Smith Act, and so he's removed from the city council. And so he can't do his work. And while he's in prison, he writes this book, right? Or rather, he writes the notes. And they're actually held by Terre Haute Federal Penitentiary until after Davis's death. They don't let go of the notes for a decade because they know that if people read this stuff and they're going to see that they have power, and that when the working class unites, they can get real things done and see progress happen, in their lifetimes. And I mean, we're living in a much different period in many respects than Davis's, but in fundamental ways, they're the same. But we can struggle against that. And we're much closer to building socialism today because of the work of people in the party in the past, like Ben Davis, like Claudia Jones, and like Gus Hall. So that's what I have.